There is a story about the Battle of the Atlantic that almost nobody tells properly. The story you have probably heard goes like this. The U-boats were beaten by Enigma. The breaking of the German naval cipher at Bletchley Park by Alan Turing and his colleagues gave the Allies the location of every German submarine, and from there it was a matter of time. The Wolfpacks were doomed. The convoys got through. This is true. It is also incomplete. There was another invention, not at Bletchley, not by mathematicians, by a refugee from Poland working in a drafty signals laboratory on the south coast of England. It was a black-painted box bolted to the deck of every Allied escort by 1943. It did not break codes. It did not need to. It listened to U-boats talking, and within seconds of a transmission beginning, it could tell you the exact direction the U-boat was lying in, not the message, the bearing, pointing at it. The first time a U-boat captain spoke on his radio inside the convoy's defensive screen, he killed himself. He did not know it. His engineer did not know it. His captain had been told the radio was safe because it transmitted for less than 30 seconds at a time. He was wrong. And the man who made him wrong was a Polish engineer named Waclaw Struszynski. The weapon he built was called High-Frequency Direction Finder. Everyone who used it called it Huff-Duff, and by some estimates, it killed more U-boats than every depth charge in the war combined. To understand why Huff-Duff mattered, you have to understand what was happening in the Atlantic in 1942 and 43. By the spring of 1942, German submarine warfare had reached its peak. Admiral Karl Donitz commanded a force of 300 operational U-boats, of which approximately 100 were at sea at any given moment. They hunted in coordinated groups called Wolfpacks. The hunting method depended entirely on radio. A U-boat operating alone would patrol a sector of the Atlantic. When it sighted a convoy, it would not attack immediately. It would shadow the convoy from beyond visual range and transmit a sighting report to U-boat headquarters in Lorient, France. Lorient would calculate the convoy's course and speed, identify all U-boats within striking distance, and order them to converge. Within 24 to 72 hours, anywhere from 6 to 15 submarines would be approaching the convoy from different directions, coordinated by short radio messages sent on high-frequency bands. They would attack at night, on the surface where they were fastest and hardest to detect. The convoy escorts, destroyers, corvettes, frigates could see the wolves only when they got close enough to be seen on the surface. By that point it was usually too late. In the spring of 1942 this method was working horrifyingly well. German U-boats sank 740,000 tons of Allied shipping in June alone. They sank 660,000 tons in July. They sank 540,000 tons in August. By the end of the year, German submarines had killed more than 1,500 Allied merchant ships and tens of thousands of merchant sailors. The Royal Navy and the United States Navy did not know how to stop them. Asdic, what the Americans called sonar, worked, but only when the submarine was already underwater inside the escort's screen, by which point a torpedo had usually already been fired. Aircraft patrols helped in areas where land-based bombers could reach, but most of the central Atlantic was a black gap where no aircraft flew. The breakthrough that everybody hoped for was code breaking. If the Allies could read U-boat radio traffic, they could route convoys around the Wolfpacks. Bletchley Park did break the naval cipher. They broke it in 1941. The Germans changed the keys in February of 42. The British went blind. They rebroke it in late 42. The Germans changed the keys again. The cipher war was a moving target, and there were long months during which no German submarine traffic was being read at all. Something else had to work. Something that did not depend on knowing what the Germans were saying. Something that simply knew where they were. His name was Waclaw Struszynski. He had been born in 1903 in Warsaw, in what was at the time Russian Poland. He trained as an electrical engineer at the Warsaw Polytechnic. By the 1930s he was working in the Polish state telecommunications industry, designing radio direction finding equipment for the Polish armed forces. He was good at it. The Polish military used direction finding to monitor Soviet and German radio traffic in the years before the war, and Struszynski's equipment was widely used. He was 36 years old when Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. He escaped through Romania with his wife. He had nothing. He travelled across the Balkans on forged documents, reached France in early 1940, and then, when France fell, escaped again. This time, on a fishing trawler from the Brittany coast that put in at Falmouth in Cornwall in late June. He stepped off the boat with the clothes he was wearing and a battered leather case containing his calculations for naval direction finding equipment. The British military had no idea what to do with the thousands of Polish refugees arriving on their shores. Most of the soldiers were absorbed into a Polish division based in Scotland. The airmen were absorbed into the Royal Air Force, where they would later distinguish themselves in the Battle of Britain. The civilians, engineers, scientists, technicians were processed at refugee centres and reassigned where possible. Somebody in the chain of paperwork noticed that Struszynski's professional background was direction finding. They sent him to the Admiralty Signal Establishment near Petersfield in Hampshire, which was the Royal Navy's main signals research centre. Struszynski arrived in late August 1940. He spoke functional but accented English. He was given a small office, a desk, and an assistant. He was told that the Royal Navy needed a working shipboard high-frequency direction finder. They had tried. They had failed. The existing British direction-finding equipment took too long to determine a bearing, was too large to mount on a small escort vessel, and was not sensitive enough to detect a U-boat radio transmission that lasted only 15 or 30 seconds. Struszynski looked at the specifications. He looked at the failed British prototypes. He looked at the time pressure, and he said in his quiet, accented English that he could solve it. They asked him how long he needed. He said 6 months. He delivered the first working prototype in 4. Now here is what made the Huff-Duff genuinely revolutionary. To understand it, you need to understand the basic principle of radio direction finding. A radio transmission is a wave that radiates outward in all directions from the antenna. If you have a receiver with a directional antenna, you can rotate the antenna until you find the direction from which the signal arrives most strongly. That direction is the bearing to the transmitter. Simple in theory, difficult in practice. The traditional method, known as the Bell-Tosi system, used a pair of crossed antennae and a hand-rotated mechanical phase shifter called a goniometer. An operator would turn the goniometer until the signal in his headphones reached a minimum, a null, and the position of the goniometer would indicate the bearing. The whole process took 15 to 30 seconds, sometimes longer. By the time the operator had the bearing, the U-boat had finished its transmission. The U-boat was gone, and the convoy had no idea where it had been. Struszynski's insight was that the manual rotation had to go. He did not need to find the null by hand. He could let the signal itself do the work. He designed a system that fed the output of the crossed antennae into a cathode ray tube, the same kind of vacuum tube used in oscilloscopes, and used the signal to deflect the electron beam directly. When a U-boat transmitted, an electronic line appeared on the cathode ray screen, pointing in the direction of the transmitter, instantly. No turning, no nulling, no operator's skill required beyond reading a compass scale on the side of the tube. The bearing was visible the moment the signal began. Think about what that means. A U-boat captain pressing his radio key, sending a sighting report to Lorient, is now visible in real time on every Allied escort within radio range. If he transmits for 15 seconds, his bearing has been written down by 10 different ships across the convoy. The escort commander can plot those bearings on a chart. Where they cross, the U-boat is. Within 2 minutes of a U-boat going on the air, the escort knows roughly where the submarine is, how far from the convoy it is sitting, and where to send aircraft or destroyers to attack. The U-boat captain does not know he has been spotted. He believes that, because he transmitted for fewer than 30 seconds on a high-frequency band, his message is safe. He has been told this in his training. He will continue to believe it until a destroyer comes over the horizon at 30 knots and starts dropping depth charges. The shipboard version was designated FH3, then later FH4. The first sets were installed on warships in 1941. By the middle of 1942, every Allied escort vessel carried one. By 1943, the system was networked into convoy command. The Royal Navy had developed an operational doctrine around it. The cathode ray tube was kept active 24 hours a day. The bearing was reported by voice to the escort commander the instant a transmission was detected. If 2 or more ships in the convoy got cross bearings, the position of the U-boat was triangulated to within a few miles. Aircraft were vectored in. Destroyers raced ahead of the convoy on the bearing. Depth charges were dropped not at random in suspected areas, but at the spot where the German captain had transmitted 60 minutes earlier, while believing he was invisible. The engineering of the antenna was Struszynski's other contribution. The crossed-loop antenna had to be mounted on top of the ship's mast to avoid being distorted by the metal of the ship's hull, but the mast vibrated, and vibration ruined the bearing accuracy. Struszynski designed a gimbaled mount with damping. He designed the cabling and the connectors. He designed the calibration procedure that allowed crews to set up the equipment without specialist technicians. The whole package – antenna, mast mount, cable, receiver, cathode ray display, calibration tools – was a complete shipboard system that an ordinary Royal Navy signaller could maintain and operate with a few weeks of training. The cost per unit was about £350, which was roughly the price of a small terrace house in 1943. £350 per ship. Pause and think about that. For the price of a small terrace in Plymouth, the Royal Navy could equip a corvette with a system that could see a German submarine the moment it spoke. Compare that to the cost of building the destroyer it was sitting on, about £300,000, and the math gets uncomfortable. The Huff-Duff was, pound for pound, the most cost-effective weapon of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. By 1943, the Allies were producing the FH-4 sets at a rate of 200 a month. The Americans, recognizing the design, built their own version with American components. The Canadians built their own. By the middle of 1943, almost every Allied warship larger than a corvette carried Huff-Duff. So did many merchantmen and rescue ships. So did patrol aircraft. The whole Atlantic became a listening room, and in the middle of the listening room sat a Polish refugee at a desk in Hampshire, refining his designs, working long hours, writing technical manuals in his accented but increasingly fluent English, and never once being mentioned in a press release. The result was visible by the spring of 1943. The German U-boat fleet had reached its peak strength in February of that year. In March, German submarines sank 120 Allied ships. It was the worst month of the entire war for Allied shipping losses. Many in the Royal Navy believed at that point that the Battle of the Atlantic was being lost. 2 months later, in May of 1943, the situation reversed. German submarines lost 41 of their own boats in that single month. Allied shipping losses dropped to 25 ships, the lowest since 1941. The German Naval Command panicked. Admiral Dönitz withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic on the 24th of May, effectively conceding the convoy battle. May of 1943 is known in German naval history as Schwarze Mai, Black May. Several factors caused it. Long-range air cover from new Liberator and Sunderland patrol aircraft was now closing the central Atlantic gap. Escort carriers were sailing with every convoy. Improved depth charges and forward-thrown weapons like the Hedgehog were sinking submarines once they were located. Bletchley Park was reading some U-boat traffic again, and Huff-Duff was on every escort. The relative contribution of each factor is disputed by historians, but the operational reports from May of 43 make one thing clear. U-boats were dying because they could not stop talking to each other. The Wolfpack tactic depended on radio coordination. Every time a U-boat reported its position to Lorient, every time a German captain acknowledged an order, every time a Wolfpack was assembling, Huff-Duff was watching. Bearings were crossing on charts in escort commanders' day cabins across the Atlantic. Aircraft were being vectored. Destroyers were charging up bearings at full speed, and the U-boats were dying, not in the act of attacking, in the act of preparing to attack. There are operational records from individual convoys that show the pattern starkly. Convoy on 202, sailing from Liverpool to Halifax in April of 1943, was located by U-boats but did not lose a single ship. The escort group detected 16 U-boat transmissions over 4 days and tracked the bearings to attack 4 different submarines, sinking 2 of them. Convoy SC-129 in March of 43 was attacked by a Wolfpack of 21 U-boats. 3 merchantmen were lost. 7 submarines were sunk. The escort group had been using Huff-Duff for 3 months. The German submariners began to suspect by mid-1943 that something had changed in the Allied detection picture. They reported that escorts seemed to be reacting faster than was possible. They reported that aircraft were arriving on patrol bearings as if pre-positioned. They reported that depth charges were being dropped on spots they had only just left. Admiral Dönitz convened internal reviews. His officers concluded that the Allies must have a new and improved radar, possibly mounted on every escort, capable of detecting a surfaced U-boat at long ranges. They never guessed the truth. They never guessed that the equipment betraying them was their own radio. They issued orders to reduce radio traffic. They installed new shorter burst transmission systems. They tried to compress messages to durations of less than 12 seconds. None of it helped, because Struszynski's cathode ray display showed the bearing instantly. 12 seconds was 12 seconds longer than it needed. The Germans never identified Huff-Duff as the cause of their losses, even after the war. It took the publication of British operational records in the 1970s for the full picture to emerge. By that time, the man who had built the equipment had retired. Compare what the Germans had to what the Allies had. The Kriegsmarine operated its own direction-finding stations along the French and Norwegian coasts. They could triangulate Allied convoy radio traffic, and they sometimes did, but their equipment used the older Bellini-Tosi goniometer method. Their bearings took 30 seconds to acquire. By then, the Allied transmission was over, and in any case, Allied convoys maintained strict radio silence at sea. The Germans could not hear them, the Germans heard nothing. Meanwhile, every time a German submariner pressed his transmitter, a line jumped on a cathode ray screen somewhere on the bridge of an Allied escort, and that submariner had between 3 and 7 days to live. Let me put you on the bridge of an Allied escort sloop in the central Atlantic, May of 1943. It is just after 2 in the morning. The sea is calm. The convoy is 20 miles to your stern, moving at 10 knots. You are the signals officer. You are watching a cathode ray tube in a small dim cabin behind the bridge. The tube is round, about 8 inches across with a faint green afterglow. The screen is calibrated in degrees. A small electrical hum fills the cabin. You have been on watch for 3 hours and you have seen nothing. Then, at 0237, a green line jumps out from the centre of the tube pointing at 125 degrees true. It holds for 14 seconds. Then it vanishes. You write down the bearing, you write down the time. You go to the speaking tube to the bridge. Bearing 125, you say. The captain on the bridge looks at his chart. He plots the bearing. He has another bearing from a sister escort, taken at the same moment from a position 8 miles north. The 2 bearings cross 15 miles due south of the convoy. There is a U-boat there, right now. The captain orders his ships onto course. Within 90 minutes, a depth charge pattern is dropped at the exact spot. There is a single oil slick at dawn, the captain writes in his log. 1 U-boat probably destroyed. The signal officer in the cabin behind the bridge goes for his cup of tea. The green afterglow fades. Waclaw Struszynski went on working at the Admiralty Signal Establishment for the rest of the war. He was not awarded any decoration by the British government. He was not knighted. He was not mentioned in the official histories of the Battle of the Atlantic published in the late 1940s. When the Polish government in exile collapsed and Stalin's communist government took over Poland, Struszynski could not go home. He stayed in Britain. He took British citizenship in 1949. He continued to work for the Admiralty as a senior research engineer, designing direction-finding equipment that would later be used for Cold War signals intelligence operations against the Soviet Union. He died in 1995 at the age of 92. He had outlived almost every U-boat commander he had helped to kill. He gave one interview late in his life to a Polish-language military history journal, in which he was asked about his work during the war. He said that he had been very busy. He said the equipment had worked. He did not boast. He did not estimate how many lives he had saved. He spoke about specific technical problems and how he had solved them, the way an engineer talks about his work. The shipboard cathode ray direction finder that he designed is the direct ancestor of every modern signals intelligence platform in the world. Every navy that listens to radio traffic and triangulates it to a target, and that is every navy in every country in the 21st century, is using a refined version of the principle Strasinski established in a Hampshire signals laboratory in 1941. The Imperial War Museum in London has a Huff-Duff cathode ray display unit on long-term loan. It is the size of a large microwave oven. The screen is dark now. The instruction plate on the side has Strasinski's design number on it. Most visitors walk past without noticing. There is a story, repeated by Royal Navy signals officers in the 1980s, that the Wolfpacks were beaten by 3 things: air cover, code breaking, and a black box that nobody could quite remember the name of. The black box had been on every escort. It had pointed at the Germans whenever they spoke, and it had been built by a Polish refugee who had walked off a fishing trawler in Falmouth in the summer of 1940 with a leather case under his arm. There are some weapons that you can hold in your hands. There are some weapons that change the war without anyone noticing. Struszynski built the second kind. They thought the U-boats were beaten by aircraft and depth charges. They thought the U-boats were beaten by Enigma. They were partly right. They were also missing something. The German captains believed that as long as they spoke briefly, they could not be heard. They were wrong. They had been wrong since the summer of 1941, when a refugee from Warsaw bent over a green glowing screen in a Hampshire laboratory and saw his first bearing line jump. They never knew the man who killed them. He never wanted them to.